At Cambridge, there are people who wake up while the rest of the world is still asleep. Elena was one of them. She hid her cracked hands deep inside the pockets of her faded apron long before her son would ever wrap his fingers around a pin to sign his name on a Harvard diploma. The city was still holding its breath. Snow lay thin and blue under the streetlights, and the air carried a sharp metallic cold that stung the lungs. Elena pushed her sanitation cart forward, its wheels squealing softly in protest. The sound cut through the silence, metal against ice, rhythm against emptiness. Each step she took was measured, economical. She had learned over the years how to conserve energy the way others saved money. The broom moved in steady arcs. Swish, pause, swish, again. The sound had followed her for decades, settling into her bones like a second pulse. A few blocks away, in a building warmed by yellow lamps and centuries of ambition, another pair of hands was awake. Julian's fingers hovered over a keyboard in Widener Library, tapping lightly, deliberately. The keys made a muted, polite sound, as if even the letters themselves were careful not to disturb the weight of history around them. His hands were clean, his nails short. There was no ink under them, no grit lodged in the creases of his skin. On his screen, lines of code, diagrams, flowcharts, urban waste systems, environmental data, efficiency models. He rubbed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and leaned back in his chair. Outside the tall windows, snow drifted past like ash from a distant fire. For a moment, he wondered, briefly, if his mother was still awake. He didn't know that she was only a mile away. Back on the street, Elena paused to catch her breath. She straightened slowly, one hand pressing against the small of her back. The cold wind slipped through the seams of her jacket and found every ache she carried. She closed her eyes, not in complaint but in calculation. Then she reached into her cart and pulled out a small, battered notebook. The cover was soft from years of handling. Inside, the pages were filled with careful handwriting, numbers aligned with almost stubborn discipline. Rent, utilities, food, transit, and always the final line written smaller than the rest, as if humility itself required less space on the page. Julian. She ran her thumb over that name, not smiling, not frowning. Pride, for Elena, was a private thing. It lived somewhere deeper than expression. The job paid decently. The city provided benefits, insurance, stability. That mattered. She had chosen this work not because it was easy, nothing about it was, but because it was reliable, predictable, honest. Every street cleaned was a promise kept. She had never told Julian how many extra shifts she picked up, never mentioned the double routes, the holidays worked while others sat at warm tables. Not because she was ashamed, but because she refused to turn her sacrifice into a weight he had to carry. Her son's job was to think, to study, to build something that mattered. The broom scraped over a frozen patch, sending a small spray of ice crystals into the air. Elena steadied herself, adjusted her gloves, and continued forward. At his desk, Julian pressed save and closed his laptop. He rested his forehead briefly against the cool wood of the table. In his mind, ideas kept looping back to one image he couldn't quite explain in his academic papers. The way waste moved through a city like blood through veins, how unseen labor kept everything else alive. He thought of home, of the quiet apartment, of a woman who never complained on the phone, who always asked only one question: "Are you eating well?" Neither of them knew they were awake at the same hour. Neither of them knew how closely their movements mirrored each other. But in the hush before dawn, in the space between a broom's whisper and a keyboard's tap, their lives were already speaking the same language, one of discipline, dignity, and a love that was so steady it never needed to announce itself. And the city, still asleep, carried their footsteps without knowing it was standing on the beginning of a miracle. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, thin, official, too clean to belong to a life like theirs. Julian found it wedged between supermarket flyers in the dorm mail slot, the Harvard crest stamped in calm authority across the corner. For a moment, his stomach tightened in that familiar way it did whenever the future came dressed as paperwork. He carried it upstairs without opening it, as if the seal might break something fragile inside him. In his room, the radiator hissed softly, coughing heat into the old air. He sat at his desk and slid a finger under the flap. The paper inside smelled faintly of toner and institutional polish, an aroma that always reminded him he was living inside someone else's dream. Financial aid award notification. His eyes moved quickly, trained by necessity. Grant amounts, expected contribution, work study. Then the line that made his throat dry. Student loan eligibility. It wasn't a demand, just an option, a door left conveniently unlocked. He stared at it anyway, because doors like that had a way of swinging shut later when you needed them most. He heard his mother's voice in his head, not loud, not dramatic. Elena never spoke in speeches. She spoke in short sentences, practical as folded towels. Debt is a shadow, Julian. It follows you even in sunlight. He folded the letter twice, carefully, like it was something he could put away and not feel. Then he called her. She picked up on the third ring. "Hi, Mama." There was background noise, a low hum and something rhythmic, almost like sweeping. He imagined the broom without even trying. "You got the letter?" she asked. Julian paused. "Yeah, I did." On the other end, Elena's breath came quiet and controlled, not anxious, never that, more like she was standing on a platform waiting for a train she'd been tracking for weeks. "It's good news," she said. "It is," Julian agreed, and meant it. Harvard's aid was generous. It was the reason he could be there. It was the reason a kid from a cramped apartment and a mother with worn hands could sit in a library built like a cathedral. But the loan line burned like a small ember. "Mama," he began carefully, "they're saying I could take loans. I don't want to, but—" "No." Elena's voice was gentle, but it didn't wobble. "You won't." Julian blinked. How can you say that so fast? There was a beat of silence long enough for him to hear the wind outside his window, scraping along the glass. Then Elena spoke again, softer. "Because you are not going to carry that. That's not why I raised you." He swallowed. "But Harvard already covers most of it. I can work more hours, or—" "You will work, but you will work for your growth, not to drown. You will not be tired in your mind because you're panicking about bills." Julian's chest tightened. He pictured her standing with her shoulders squared, like the world could push, but it would not bend her. Still, a question rose in him like a guilty wave. "And you are okay, Mama, money-wise?" Elena gave a small sound, almost a laugh, but not quite. Julian, I have a job. I have hours. I'm fine. He wanted to believe her. He did, because she sounded like truth. Elena always sounded like truth. But there was something else, something too smooth, too rehearsed. A week later, Julian received another envelope, not from Harvard. It was plain white, no crest, no formal header line, just his name written neatly, almost old-fashioned. Inside was a check, clean, crisp, and startling in its simplicity, and a note. Local scholarship fund support for books, food, whatever you need. Don't worry. Focus. Julian stared at the handwriting. It wasn't Elena's, or it wasn't the Elena he knew. He called her again. "Mama," he said slowly, "this check, this scholarship, who is it from?" Elena's reply came too quickly, as if she'd been standing beside the answer all along. "A small community fund," she said. "People who help good students. They liked your story." Julian's heart warmed and ached at once. "You told them about me?" "I didn't have to," Elena said. "Cambridge is small in its own way. People notice." He wanted to ask more. He wanted to press until the truth came out like water from a squeezed cloth. But then Elena's voice softened, and he heard, underneath it, the faintest tremor of fatigue she was trying to hide. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything. Promise me you will not spend your best years worrying about survival," Elena whispered. "Promise me you will use your mind for what it was made for." Julian closed his eyes. In his imagination, he saw her at a table somewhere, under a flickering light, counting something. Not coins, not just numbers, counting time. "I promise," he said. And Elena, alone in her narrow rented room, set the phone down with careful hands, hands that were beginning to ache in ways she refused to name. On her small table sat a stack of identical envelopes, each one sealed, each one addressed to Julian. Beside them, her worn notebook open to a page where she had written, in tidy ink, "No loans, not for him." Then she reached for a cup of instant noodles, the steam rising thin and pale in the cold room, and she ate quietly, like someone who had already chosen what she would give up and didn't need applause for it. Spring arrived in Cambridge the way it always did, cautiously. The snow didn't disappear so much as it retreated, melting into thin streams that ran along the curb like whispered secrets. The trees on Harvard Yard began to soften at the edges, buds swelling as if the city were finally exhaling after months of holding its shoulders up against winter. Julian walked through the yard with a stack of books pressed to his chest, feeling the strange double life of it all, the beauty of the place and the quiet pressure of belonging to it. Around him, laughter floated in bright bursts. Students in clean shoes and effortless coats leaned against old brick walls, talking about internships, summer plans, ski trips that sounded like stories from another planet. Julian smiled when he was supposed to. He nodded at the right moments. He learned how to let his gratitude stay hidden, because gratitude, when you had too much of it, could look like desperation. That afternoon, his phone buzzed. "Mama." He answered quickly, stepping out of the flow of students and into the shadow of a tree. "Hi, Mama." "Hi," Elena said. Her voice came through the line steady as ever, but he could hear the wind on her side, thin, sharp, moving past the microphone like a broom bristle across pavement. Julian's eyes lifted toward the red brick dorms, the tall windows, the flags that fluttered like quiet authority. "We have a thing this weekend, a research presentation. Families can come." A pause. Julian filled the silence with warmth, as if warmth could build a bridge. "You should come, please. You'd love it. It's in the Science Center. They'll have coffee and—" "Elena." He heard her inhale, like someone stepping into cold water. "I can't." Julian's chest tightened. "Why not?" "I have a shift," she said, too quickly. "You can swap. You have sick days, don't you? Or I can talk to someone. I can—" "No." Her voice was still gentle, but it carried that quiet steel he knew since childhood. "Julian, don't make this complicated." He stared at a patch of grass where the snow had finally surrendered. "It's not complicated. It's just, I want you here." The truth was bigger than the presentation. It was bigger than a weekend event. Julian wanted to see his mother sitting in a chair among the other parents. He wanted, for once, to look out into the world he had fought to enter and not feel like he had left her behind at the door. He wanted Harvard to witness her. But Elena's answer stayed the same. Not this time. A week later, there was another invitation, a small departmental dinner for scholarship recipients and faculty mentors. Julian tried again, then again, athletic meet, student showcase, even a casual walk through the yard when the tulips bloomed. Each time, Elena offered a reason that sounded reasonable if you didn't listen too closely. "I'm tired. I'm not feeling well. I can't get off. Next time." The words stacked up like bricks, and Julian, who could read data sets and decode academic language, began to sense the message inside the message. It wasn't that she couldn't come, it was that she wouldn't. One evening, Elena finished her shift early. The sky was turning to color of wet slate, and the wind pushed small scraps of paper across the sidewalk like nervous animals. She should have gone home. She should have rested. Instead, she took the subway toward Harvard Square. Her boots were still damp. Her hands still carried the faint sting of chemical cleanser, even after she'd scrubbed them in the station restroom. She wore her plain coat and a knitted hat pulled low, the kind that didn't invite anyone's attention. When she surfaced above ground, she didn't head toward the tourist paths. She moved along the edges, staying close to buildings, letting the world flow past her. Then she saw it. Harvard Yard. The iron gate stood like a sentence, elegant, historic, and quietly deciding who belonged. Elena stopped across the street, her breath fogging in the cold air. From where she stood, she could see students moving in groups, laughing, leaning, living as if the world had always made space for them. Their voices carried like music, light and careless. And then, Julian. He was walking with two classmates, his Harvard coat buttoned, his scarf tucked in neatly. He listened while one of them spoke, smiling in that restrained, polite way he had learned here. He looked taller than she remembered, older. His shoulders carried a weight she had helped him earn. Elena's throat tightened. Her fingers curled around the strap of her bag. For a heartbeat, she lifted her hand, just a little, as if she might call his name. Julian turned slightly, and the late light caught his face. Elena saw it then. Not the success, not the confidence, the effort. The way he held himself like someone who was still afraid the ground might vanish if he stepped wrong. A lump rose in her chest. Pride, yes, but also something sharper. Because if she stepped forward, if she let herself be seen in her worn coat with the faint smell of the streets clinging to her, would that make his ground less steady? Elena's hand lowered. She told herself she was protecting him. She told herself she was being strong. But standing there, just outside the gate, Elena understood the cruelest thing about love like hers. Sometimes it built walls without meaning to. Julian and his friends passed by, their footsteps fading into the yard. Julian never looked toward the street. He never saw the woman watching him with her whole heart. Elena took one step back into the shadow of a building, then another. and when the wind swept across the yard, it carried the sound of laughter over the iron fence, while Elena turned away, swallowing the name she wanted to speak. Winter returned like a heavy coat you couldn't shrug off. The kind of winter that didn't just chill your skin, it pressed into your joints, turned every breath into work, and made the city sound different. Even the usual noises, engines, footsteps, distant sirens, felt muffled, as if Cambridge had wrapped itself in thick wool and decided to endure in silence. Elena's shift started before dawn, as always. The streetlights still burned, casting pale pools of light on snow that looked clean from a distance and dirty up close. Gray slush, salted ice, footprints layered over footprints. Her cart rattled over uneven pavement, wheels bumping like loose teeth. Each jolt traveled up her arms and settled into her shoulders. She adjusted her gloves and kept moving. Swish, scrape, swish. The broom bristles made a steady hush against the ground, like someone whispering the same prayer again and again. Elena had learned to ignore pain the way some people ignored bad news. It wasn't denial, it was efficiency. Pain didn't change the route. Pain didn't pay bills. Pain didn't keep a promise. But that night, the cold felt sharper than usual. It found the small gaps she usually protected, the seam of her jacket, the thin spot in her glove, the place behind her knee that always ached when the temperature dropped. Still, she worked, because somewhere in a warmer building, her son was studying. Somewhere, Julian was typing, reading, building his future with a mind she refused to let be distracted by survival. Elena pulled her notebook from her apron pocket during a break. The paper inside felt stiff from the cold. She flipped to the last page. Her writing was tidy, controlled. Julian, February. An amount circled, a date underlined. She tapped her pen against the page, as if confirming to herself that the numbers were real, that the plan was still holding. A gust of wind slapped her face, and she blinked hard. For a moment, the street tilted, just slightly, like a horizon that couldn't decide where it belonged. Elena straightened, steadying herself with one hand on the cart handle. Her breath came out in short puffs, white and thin. She told herself it was nothing. She had a shift to finish. 2 blocks later, her vision blurred again. A strange warmth rose in her chest, too fast, too sudden, like a match struck in the wrong place. The sound around her changed, as if someone had turned the world's volume knob down. The broom slipped in her grip. Elena caught it, annoyed with herself. She flexed her fingers, feeling a numbness that didn't match the cold. Not now, she thought, not as a plea, but as an instruction. She took another step, and then the streetlights stretched. The pavement rushed up. For a second, there was no pain, just absence, like falling into a quiet room. When her eyes opened, fluorescent light buzzed above her. The air smelled of antiseptic and warmed plastic. Somewhere down the hall, a machine beeped steadily, patient and indifferent. Elena tried to sit up. A nurse's voice stopped her gently. "Easy, ma'am. You fainted. You're in the ER." Elena's mind snapped awake, not with fear for herself, but with panic that was sharp and immediate. Her hands flew to her apron, her pockets, her bag. The nurse caught her wrist. "It's okay, your things are right here." Elena's fingers found the envelope in her apron pocket, crumpled but intact. Then the notebook, then the folded check she had prepared earlier, sealed and addressed. She exhaled, but the relief didn't soften her face. It only tightened her jaw. "What time is it?" she demanded. The nurse blinked, surprised by the urgency. "A little after 2 in the morning." Elena calculated instantly. If she missed the mail pickup in the morning, Julian wouldn't receive it on time. If he didn't receive it on time, he might, just for a moment, worry, and worrying was the one luxury she refused to let him have. "I need to go," Elena said, pushing the blanket aside. The nurse frowned. "You need to rest. Your blood pressure dropped. You're dehydrated." "I can rest later," Elena said, already swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the authority of a woman who had been making impossible things happen for years. A doctor came in, calm, professional, trying to slow her down with careful words. "Miss Maris, you had a syncopal episode. Fainting. We need to run tests, please." Elena looked at him the way she looked at numbers, without drama, only meaning. "My son is in his final term. He is doing something important. He cannot be distracted." The doctor softened. "We can call him. We can let him know you're okay." "No." The word came out like a door being shut. The doctor studied her. "Why not?" Elena's throat moved once. She swallowed the truth before it could become a confession. "Because," she said, steadying her hands on the bedrail, "he will hear it in my voice, and then he will come running. And if he comes running, he won't be where he needs to be." A beat of silence. Even the machine's beeping seemed to hesitate. The doctor nodded slowly, understanding something he couldn't chart. "All right," he said, "we won't call him, but you stay here tonight." Elena's eyes flicked to the clock, to the door, to the envelope in her hand. She nodded once, a small concession, but inside her mind was already outside the hospital, already walking the route, already listening to the broom's whisper, already planning how to make the morning happen. Because Elena had never measured love in words, she measured it in what she refused to let her son carry. And that night, under harsh hospital light, she held the check like a fragile promise, more precious to her than rest, more urgent than her own heartbeat. Julian didn't know about the hospital. He didn't know about the way his mother's body had finally demanded what her pride would not allow her to ask for: pause, warmth, help. No one called him. No message reached his inbox. No siren ever pierced the thick stone walls of Widener Library with her name attached. All he knew was what Elena had carefully arranged for him to know, that everything was fine. And in a strange way, that lie became its own kind of shelter. Because Julian was not floating through Harvard on luck or charm. He was moving through it the way you move through deep water, quiet, focused, conserving breath. He carried his gratitude like a secret that weighed more than his textbooks. His days began early, often before the sun had made up its mind. The dorm hallways smelled of laundry detergent and old radiator heat. He'd pull on a hoodie, slip out with his laptop under his arm, and walk to the dining hall while the floorboards still creaked with sleep. He ate fast, not because he didn't enjoy food, but because he didn't trust comfort. Comfort felt like something borrowed. Then came the first job, teaching assistant for an introductory course. He stood in front of younger students, explaining concepts with a calmness he didn't always feel. His voice was steady, his handwriting clear on the board. When a student apologized for not being good at this, Julian heard his mother in his memory, heard the quiet firmness that never allowed self-pity to take root. "Skill is repetition," he told them, "not destiny." After that, he crossed campus to his second job, washing dishes in a busy cafe just off Harvard Square. The place always smelled like burnt espresso and warm sugar. The sink area was loud, water rushing, plates clacking, coworkers talking over each other in half-shouted jokes. Julian worked silently. The steam wet his sleeves, the soap dried his knuckles. He stacked plates with the same careful precision he used in his code. In the clatter of the kitchen, he sometimes imagined his mother's world, her cartwheels over ice, her broom against pavement. Different sounds, same rhythm, work that kept other people's lives running smoothly. Late afternoons belonged to classes and lab meetings. Evenings belonged to the third job, though no one would have called it that. His project. It started as a question he couldn't stop hearing. Why did some neighborhoods stay cleaner than others? Why did the same corners collect the same trash again and again, like a pattern the city refused to notice? At first, he told himself it was academic curiosity. Then he admitted what it really was. His mother had made him see the city from the ground up. While other students studied systems in theory, Julian carried a map of reality inside him, built from the smell of disinfectant, the sight of Elena's tired shoes by the door, the quiet way she counted money and never counted herself. He began building an application, a smart, data-driven tool for municipal waste optimization. Not flashy, not Silicon Valley cool, but useful. It would track waste volume patterns by block, predict overflow points, and recommend smarter route scheduling so sanitation workers didn't have to redo the same stretches twice. It would flag dangerous zones during snowstorms. It would reduce fuel usage. It would make the work safer, more efficient, more humane. Some nights, Julian worked until the library lights dimmed and the air turned thin and stale. The only sounds were the soft tapping of his keys and the distant, lonely sigh of a building settling. Tap, tap, tap. He would pause sometimes, listening to the silence after each line of code, as if waiting for an answer. One night, he opened his phone and stared at the last check Elena had sent. The note still sat in his drawer, its carefully staged handwriting claiming it came from a local scholarship fund. Julian knew he was a story. He didn't know the details, but he knew his mother. He knew the way she built dignity out of scraps. He knew she wouldn't let him hear her struggle, because she believed love should feel like safety, not like debt. So he made a decision. If Elena had built him a quiet world to study in, he would build her a future where quiet didn't require pain. He began reaching out to professors, not for help with tuition, but for guidance, testing, pilots, introductions. He entered the project into a campus innovation competition. He presented it with the kind of controlled passion that didn't beg for applause. This, he told the judges, is about honoring labor we treat as invisible. The room nodded politely, like privileged rooms often did. But something shifted anyway. A week later, an email arrived from a visiting executive in an environmental technology firm. They wanted to talk. They were interested. They asked if he had a prototype, if he could demonstrate a model, if he could meet. Julian read the email 3 times, his heartbeat loud in his ears. Then he did what he always did when something mattered. He got to work. Outside, the wind sharpened again, rattling branches against the window. Julian pulled his hoodie tighter, his fingers moving faster now, not frantic, but determined. And somewhere out in the sleeping city, on streets he hadn't walked in years, his mother's world continued without him knowing how close it was to breaking. 2 struggles running in parallel, one built on keeping a secret, one built on turning that secret into something that could finally set them both free. The letter took longer to arrive than an email would have. That was the point. Julian had stared at the blank page for nearly an hour before writing the first word, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew that once it was written, it would carry a weight no screen could soften. He chose his pen carefully, blue ink, steady flow, the kind that didn't smudge if your hand hesitated. Mama, this is the last time I will ask you like this. He paused, listening to the radiator click and sigh behind him. The dorm was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that made you hear your own breathing. I won't step onto that stage if I don't see you there. He wrote slowly, deliberately, the way his mother counted money, nothing wasted, nothing exaggerated. I need you in the room, not watching from far away, not standing outside the gate, sitting there, where you belong. When he finished, Julian folded the letter once, then again, aligning the edges carefully. He slid it into an envelope, wrote her address by hand, and sealed it with a firmness that felt like resolve. At the post office, the clerk weighed it, stamped it, and dropped it into a bin filled with other lives' messages. Julian watched it disappear, his chest tight with something that felt like both hope and fear. Across town, Elena found the letter waiting for her on a narrow kitchen table in her rented room. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint groan of pipes behind the walls. A single bulb cast warm light over chipped linoleum. Elena had just come in from work. Her boots sat by the door, damp and tired. Her hands, bare now, ached in a dull, familiar way. She recognized Julian's handwriting instantly. Her name, written with care. Elena sat down slowly. For a moment, she didn't open the envelope. She rested her palms on the table instead, feeling the pulse in her fingertips, feeling the places where the skin had thickened, where years of grip and pressure had left their mark. When she read the letter, she read it twice. By the second time, her vision blurred. Not because the words were harsh, they weren't. They were simple, direct, honest in a way that didn't leave her anywhere to hide. I won't step onto that stage if I don't see you there. Elena closed her eyes. The reasons she had built over years rose up quickly like a practiced defense. She would look out of place. She would draw the wrong kind of attention. She would make him self-conscious among people who had never had to hide their hands. But beneath those reasons was something she had avoided naming. Fear. Not of judgment, but of being seen. Seen not as a helper, not as a background force, but as the source. Elena stood and walked to the small bathroom mirror. The light there was unforgiving. She studied her reflection the way she studied expenses, carefully, without indulgence. The lines on her face were deeper than she remembered. Her hair, pulled back tightly, showed threads of gray she had been too busy to notice. And her hands. She lifted them slowly. The skin was rough, cracked in places, calloused along the palms and fingers. Hands shaped by work that did not pause for applause. For years she had hidden them out of love, out of a belief that sacrifice should be quiet. But Julian wasn't asking her to hide. He was asking her to stand. The next afternoon, Elena stepped into a thrift store a few blocks from her apartment. A bell chimed softly above the door. The air smelled faintly of old fabric and dust, and something sweet, like the memory of other lives. She moved through the racks slowly, touching sleeves, checking seams. She wasn't looking for elegance. She was looking for something that didn't apologize. She chose a simple dress, dark blue, modest cut. It fit well enough. She held it up against herself, studying the way the fabric fell. At the counter, the cashier smiled politely. Special occasion? Elena hesitated, then nodded. My son is graduating. That's wonderful, the woman said, genuine warmth in her voice. Elena felt her throat tighten. She paid in cash. That evening, she washed the dress carefully in the sink and hung it to dry. She set it where she could see it from the table. For a long time, she sat there, listening to the hum of the room, the quiet that had always been enough. Except now. Now there was a letter on the table. Now there was a choice. Elena folded Julian's letter and placed it in her worn notebook right next to the page where she tracked his future in numbers. Then she reached for a pair of thin fabric gloves, clean, neatly folded. She slipped them into her bag, not to hide, but because she didn't yet know how to let go of the habit. And as the city settled into night, Elena lay awake longer than usual. imagining a stage she had never seen, a crowd she had never faced, and a son asking her, finally, not to protect him from the world, but to let the world see her. Morning in Cambridge arrived dressed in gold, not the harsh brightness of summer, but a clean, ceremonial light. Sunshine filtered through spring leaves, warming brick walls that had watched generations pass. The air smelled faintly of lilacs and fresh-cut grass, and somewhere beyond the yard, the city's usual noises softened, as if even traffic understood it was a special day. Elena stepped off the train at Harvard Square with her bag held close to her side. The dress she had bought, dark blue, simple, felt unfamiliar against her skin, like clothing borrowed from a different life. She had pinned her hair back more carefully than usual. She wore modest shoes that didn't squeak, and on her hands, thin fabric gloves. Not thick enough to hide everything, but enough to make her feel less exposed, enough to let her breathe. She moved with the caution of someone entering a room where she doesn't know the rules. People flowed around her in confident streams, parents in tailored coats, families speaking in quick bursts of excitement, cameras already raised, laughter spilling easily into the air. Elena heard snippets as she walked, words like internship, legacy, endowment, family weekend. The syllables floated past her like birds she couldn't catch. She kept her eyes forward. Harvard's campus was transformed. Banners hung neatly, white folding chairs lined up in perfect rows. The stage rose ahead like a promise, dressed with flowers that looked effortless in their beauty. Elena's chest tightened. She thought of her own mornings, streetlights, slush, the broom's whisper, the cart's wheels complaining under too much weight, the city still asleep while she worked in its shadow. Here, everything was awake, everything was watching. A volunteer handed her a small program. Elena took it with both hands, a reflex of respect. The paper was thick and smooth. She traced the printed words with a gloved finger as if to prove they were real. Harvard University Commencement. For a moment, she didn't step forward. She simply stood there, absorbing the soundscape, distant music warming up, a low crowd murmur like ocean swell, the crisp snap of flags in the breeze. Then she remembered Julian's letter. "I won't step onto that stage if I don't see you there." She forced her feet to move. Elena chose the farthest row, not because it was assigned, but because distance had always been her instinct. If she stayed near the back, she could leave quietly if she needed to. She could remain a shadow if the light became too much. She sat down carefully, smoothing her dress over her knees. Around her, parents adjusted sunglasses and compared camera lenses. Someone nearby dabbed at happy tears already forming. Elena folded her hands in her lap. Her heart beat louder than the music. She tried to keep her breathing slow, controlled, but the air felt thinner here, full of perfume and expectation. On the stage, the orchestra began. Strings rose first, gentle, elegant, then brass, then a swell that made the whole space feel lifted. The sound was beautiful. And it hurt, because the music was the opposite of her world. Her world was brooms and engines and the scrape of metal. Her world didn't swell, it endured. Elena swallowed hard and stared at the stage. As graduates filed in, a wave of black gowns moved like a river. Caps bobbed, tassels flickered in sunlight. Names were called out for seating. Laughter burst and then quieted, as if everyone was learning how to hold their joy politely. Elena searched the crowd with increasing panic. They all looked the same at first, black robes, bright faces, young hands waving at families. Her fingers clenched inside her gloves. Then she saw him, Julian. Even from far away, she recognized the way he held his shoulders, straight but not arrogant,
the way he turned his head slightly, scanning the crowd, looking, not for friends, not for professors, for her. Elena's throat tightened. She raised her hand halfway, then stopped. She didn't want to draw attention. She didn't want to make noise. She wanted to be seen, but not noticed. Julian's gaze kept moving. For one awful second, Elena feared he wouldn't find her in time. And then Julian's eyes landed on the back row, on her. His face didn't break into a grin. Julian wasn't that kind of boy. Instead, something quiet softened around his eyes. Relief, gratitude, a kind of trembling peace. His shoulders dropped just slightly, as if he'd been holding a weight too long. Elena felt her own breath catch. He gave the smallest nod, barely visible to anyone else. But it was enough. It said, "You came." Elena nodded back. And for the first time in years, the wall she had built between them, made of pride and protection and fear of judgment, developed a crack. Behind her, someone stood. Elena didn't turn at first. She didn't want distractions, but she sensed movement, sensed a presence that felt different from the polished parents around her. Then a voice, warm and familiar, murmured close to her ear. "Elena?" She turned and froze. Two people in sanitation uniforms stood in the aisle, clean but unmistakable, the same navy fabric, the same city patch on the sleeve. Elena recognized them instantly. Colleagues, people who had shared cold mornings and heavy routes with her, people who had heard her say 100 times, "I'm fine." They smiled. "We took the day off," one of them said softly. "Couldn't miss this." Elena's lips parted, but no words came. The colleague squeezed her shoulder gently, like anchoring her. "You're not invisible today," the woman whispered. "Not to him, not to us." Elena looked back toward the stage. Julian was still facing forward, but she saw it, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes shone. He knew. And as the orchestra played on and the crowd rose for the formal opening, Elena sat in the farthest row, gloves folded now in her lap, surrounded by people who had done the same hard work as her, and for the first time she felt herself exist in the light without shrinking away from it.
The ceremony moved with the slow grandeur of tradition. Names of dignitaries, Latin phrases, applause that rose and fell in practiced waves. Elena tried to follow, but her mind kept drifting to Julian, where he sat among the graduates. How still he was, how his hands rested on his lap as if he were holding something delicate inside his chest. The sun climbed higher, warming the tops of heads, catching on camera lenses like tiny flashes of lightning. A breeze moved through the yard, lifting programs, fluttering tassels, carrying the faint scent of grass and perfume and new beginnings. Elena's colleagues sat close on either side of her, like quiet guardians. She didn't ask how they'd known to come. She didn't ask how they'd found her. She only felt the strange, unfamiliar safety of being surrounded by people who understood the weight of early mornings. Then the moment arrived. A voice over the microphone announced the valedictorian. Elena heard Julian's name, clear, ringing, followed by an eruption of applause that felt like thunder rolling across the chairs. She pressed her lips together hard, trying to keep her face composed, but her eyes burned anyway. Julian stood. His black gown shifted as he moved, the fabric catching sunlight. From the back row, Elena could see him take one breath, slow and deep, before stepping forward. The path to the podium seemed long, lined with expectation. He walked as if each step mattered. When he reached the microphone, the world quieted in that magical, collective way crowds do when they're ready to be moved. Elena could hear tiny things now, the rustle of robes, a distant bird calling, someone's bracelet clinking softly as they folded their hands. Julian adjusted the mic slightly. His fingers were steady, but Elena, who had watched him as a boy learning to hide his fear, noticed the small tension in his jaw. He looked out over the sea of faces. Then, very deliberately, he did something unexpected. He didn't begin with his achievements. He didn't begin with Harvard. He didn't begin with himself. He began with a sound. "When I was a kid," Julian said, voice clear and warm, "I used to wake up before my alarm, not because I wanted to, but because I could hear the city breathing." A ripple of soft laughter. Julian continued, and his words painted the air like a film. "I could hear a broom sweeping outside our building. Swish. Pause. Swish again. I didn't know what that sound meant back then. I only knew it meant morning was coming." Elena's throat tightened. The sound was in her bones. Hearing it named aloud in this grand place felt like someone turning a hidden light on her life. Julian's gaze drifted across the crowd, but not with the casual sweep of a speaker. He was searching, anchoring himself. "My mother," he said, "worked for the city. She was a sanitation worker, one of the people we rarely see until the day they're not there." The crowd grew stiller. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Julian's voice softened. "I'm standing here because of a woman who learned how to disappear." Elena's colleagues shifted beside her. One of them exhaled sharply, like a sob swallowed back. Julian continued, and he wasn't dramatic. He wasn't begging for sympathy. His tone held that rare balance, love without pity, respect without spectacle. "Harvard gave me financial aid, and I'm grateful. But what Harvard couldn't give me was peace. Peace came from home. Peace came from knowing that when I opened my laptop, someone else was waking up in the cold so I wouldn't have to think about rent, groceries, heat." Elena's fingers curled around the edge of her program. The paper crinkled softly. Julian's eyes shone now, but his voice did not break. He had learned from Elena, if something matters, you hold it steady. "I didn't want to repay her with money, because love isn't a bill you settle. I wanted to repay her with meaning." He paused, letting the sentence land. "So I built something." A small stir went through the audience. Julian lifted his chin, and for a moment he looked less like a student and more like someone stepping into purpose. "I developed a technology platform that helps cities manage waste routes more intelligently, predicting overflow points, reducing fuel use, flagging dangerous winter zones, and protecting the workers who keep our streets livable." Elena blinked, stunned. She knew he was studying, knew he was working, but she hadn't known this. She hadn't known he had turned her world into a blueprint for something bigger. Julian's voice warmed, the way it does when gratitude becomes action. "It's called Clean Line, because for most of my life, the clean lines of this city were drawn by hands no one applauded." He took another breath. Then his words grew even quieter. "And today," he said, "I want to applaud those hands." He turned his head slightly toward the camera crew at the side of the stage. "I have one request," he said, calm but firm. "Please, if you can, pan the camera to the back rows." A ripple of confusion, then curiosity. The camera operator hesitated. Elena's heartbeat punched hard against her ribs. "No," she whispered instinctively, half rising. The old reflex, hide, protect, disappear, surged up like a tide. But then the sanitation workers beside her stood too, not blocking her, not forcing her, simply standing, shoulders square, uniforms visible, like a small, quiet honor guard. One of them smiled at Elena, steady and warm. "Stay," she murmured. "Let him finish." The camera turned.
The large screen near the stage flickered, shifting. Rows of faces passed in quick cuts. Then, suddenly, Elena's face filled the screen. Her gloved hands clasped tightly, her eyes wide, wet, stunned. A collective gasp moved through the crowd like wind through leaves. Julian's voice reached her again, closer now, as if he were speaking directly into her chest. "That's my mother, Elena." He didn't add a last name. He didn't need to. In that moment, she didn't belong to paperwork. She belonged to love. "And if you remember anything from my speech," Julian said, his voice finally trembling just slightly, "remember this. A city's greatness isn't only in its universities and monuments, it's in the people who wake up unseen so everyone else can wake up unafraid." Elena's breath shook. The gloves in her lap suddenly felt too small, too thin to hold back what she'd spent years hiding. And as applause rose, slow at first, then swelling into something that sounded like rain on a roof, Elena sat in the back row, no longer invisible, and heard the world finally say thank you without her having to ask.
Applause rolled over the yard like a living thing. It started in pockets, one row, then another, until it became a single, swelling sound that seemed to lift the air itself. Elena felt it in her chest, vibrating through bone and breath. On the large screen, her own face looked unfamiliar, older, startled, exposed. Her first instinct was to stand and leave. She shifted forward, hands tightening around the program, the fabric gloves suddenly feeling like a costume that didn't belong. She could already imagine the stares, the whispered judgments, the invisible measuring that wealthy rooms sometimes did without meaning to. But then, a hand, warm, steady, touched her elbow. Her colleague. The woman beside her didn't squeeze hard, she simply held her there like an anchor. "Breathe," she whispered, as if reminding Elena she had permission to take up air. Elena swallowed. Her breath came shallow at first, then steadier. She stared ahead at the stage, at Julian standing tall behind the podium. Even from far away, she could see how his hands were gripping the edges, how he was trying to hold himself together the way she had taught him. Quiet strength, no spectacle. Julian finished his speech with a final line that made the crowd rise again, applause turning into a standing ovation. Elena's ears rang, the sun glinted off camera lenses, the orchestra's instruments shifted, small metallic clicks. Then something happened that wasn't on any schedule. Julian stepped away from the microphone. He didn't return to his seat. He looked toward the back rows, toward her, and he began walking. At first, Elena thought she was imagining it. The stage had stairs on both sides. Graduates didn't typically leave the front like that. It felt like the choreography of tradition had been interrupted by a human heart. Julian moved quickly, but not frantically. As he walked, people parted instinctively, like water giving way. Some clapped, some held their phones higher, others simply watched, silent, as if they sensed they were witnessing something rare, gratitude made visible. Elena's body went rigid. "No," she mouthed, barely making sound. "Julian!" But Julian kept coming, and Elena understood with sudden clarity that this wasn't only his moment, it was hers too, whether she wanted it or not. He reached her row and stopped in the aisle, breathing hard, eyes shining. For a second, mother and son stared at each other as if they were seeing one another without the old filters, without the protective lies, without the careful distance. Julian's voice was low, meant only for her. "You came." Elena tried to respond, but the words jammed in her throat. She nodded once. That was all she could manage. Julian smiled, not the polished smile he used in classrooms, but the one he used as a child when he'd built something with his hands and wanted her to notice. Then he held out his hand.
Elena looked at it as if it were a door she didn't know how to open. Her gloved fingers hovered. Julian waited. He didn't tug, didn't rush. He simply stood there, offering, letting her dignity choose its own pace. Elena placed her hand in his. Julian's grip was careful, warm. His palm was smooth, but his fingers tightened with a strength that felt earned. He guided her out into the aisle. The crowd quieted again, a hush falling as if everyone had leaned closer at once. Elena could hear her own breathing, thin and tremulous. She could hear the faint squeak of her shoes on the grass as Julian led her forward. Step by step, she moved closer to the stage. She felt eyes on her from every direction, but she also felt something else, something she hadn't expected. Respect. Not pity, not charity. Respect. Steady and serious, like the kind her colleagues gave each other when they finished a brutal shift and still showed up the next day. At the foot of the stage, Julian paused. He turned to face her fully. Then he reached for her hands. Elena stiffened instinctively, but Julian's touch was gentle, almost reverent. His thumbs found the edges of her thin gloves. "Mama," he whispered, and in that single word was every morning he'd ever needed her. Elena's eyes widened. "Julian, don't." But he did. Slowly, carefully, he slid the gloves off her hands. The air hit her skin like a confession. Her fingers looked stark without fabric, calluses, cracks, rough patches that told the truth she'd tried to keep private. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elena's face flushed hot under the sun. She wanted to hide her hands again, fold them into her sleeves, retreat into the smallest version of herself. But Julian lifted them instead. He raised her hands as if presenting something precious, and then he kissed them. Not quickly, not for show. One kiss on the palm, one on the knuckles, a final kiss near the wrist, where her pulse beat, a soft reminder she was still here. Elena's breath broke. A sound escaped her. Not a sob, not a word, something between the two. Julian looked up at her. "These hands," he said, his voice trembling now, loud enough for the microphone to catch as the nearest camera swung close, "held my whole life together." He turned slightly toward the crowd. "I want to say something I've never said out loud." He took Elena's hands and placed them gently against his chest, right over his heart. "My mother didn't work so I could pay Harvard. Harvard helped with that. She worked so I could study without fear, so I could build without panic, so I could sleep and wake up believing tomorrow was possible." Elena blinked rapidly, overwhelmed by the clean brightness of the truth. Julian reached into the inside pocket of his gown and pulled out a folded document, a printed sheet with a simple logo and a headline, "Clean Line Acquisition Agreement." His voice steadied, the way it did when he taught. "A few weeks ago, an environmental technology company acquired the platform I built, not to lock it away, to scale it, to put it in real cities, to protect real workers." A wave of surprised sound rose again from the crowd, soft gasps, whispers, a swell of applause beginning to form. Julian lifted Elena's hands slightly. "And the first thing I'm doing with that money," he said, "is creating a health and safety fund for sanitation workers, starting right here. Insurance support, winter gear, mental health resources, scholarships for their kids." Elena's knees trembled. She gripped his hands back, hard. Julian leaned closer, his voice dropping to something only she could truly hear. "This is for you, but it's also because of you." Elena stared at him, at the boy who had once apologized for needing new shoes, now standing tall and offering her the world with the same calm dignity she had tried to give him. She tried to speak. All that came out was a whisper, broken and honest. "I didn't want you to carry me." Julian shook his head, eyes wet. "You didn't make me carry you, Mama.
You taught me how to carry others." Behind them, the crowd rose to its feet again, applause thundering, less like celebration now and more like acknowledgement, as if the yard itself had finally learned the shape of the true crown that day. Not a diploma, not a title, but a mother's hands, held up in sunlight, no longer hidden. The morning after commencement did not arrive with fireworks. There were no champagne toasts in a penthouse, no glossy photos in luxury cars, no sudden transformation into a life that looked like someone else's dream. If anything, the day came quietly, soft light sliding across a modest kitchen table, a kettle beginning to hum, a window cracked open to let in air that smelled like damp soil and new leaves. Elena woke before her alarm out of habit. For a few seconds, she didn't know where she was. Then she remembered Julian's small apartment just outside the square, where he'd insisted she stay for a few days. The bed was too soft, the silence too complete. No cartwheels, no streetlights, no broom waving like a responsibility. She sat up slowly, hands resting on the blanket. Bare hands. The gloves were folded neatly on the chair. She looked at them the way you look at an old shield, something that protected you but also kept you from being touched. Elena flexed her fingers. The cracks were still there, the calluses unchanged. But something inside her had shifted. The shame she'd never named, only managed, felt thinner, less necessary. From the next room came the quiet sound of typing. Tap, tap, tap. Not frantic, not desperate. A calm rhythm. The rhythm of a mind building something with purpose. Elena stood and padded into the living room. Julian was at his table, laptop open, coffee steaming beside him. He looked up when he sensed her presence, and his face softened immediately. "Morning, Mama." Elena nodded once. She still wasn't a woman of many words, but the way she stood there, unhurried, unguarded, said more than speeches. Julian pushed the chair beside him back slightly. "Sit with me?" Elena hesitated. In her world, sitting during daylight felt suspicious, like stolen time, but she sat. The chair creaked faintly under her weight. Outside, a bird called once, clear and sharp. Elena listened as if she was learning a new language: leisure, safety, breath. Julian turned the laptop toward her. The screen showed a clean interface, maps, icons, simple colors. He clicked, and a city grid appeared, lines representing routes. "This is the rollout plan," he said. "First pilot city signed, second is in negotiation, and—" he paused, glancing at her hands. "And the worker support fund is real, Mama. Paperwork's already moving." Elena stared at the screen, not fully understanding the technology, but understanding the intention, like she understood a broom without knowing who invented it. "You did all this?" Her voice came out rough, unused. "I didn't do it alone," Julian said softly. "I just translated what you already knew." Elena swallowed. Her eyes drifted to the window where sunlight touched the small balcony outside. Julian had placed a potted plant there, green and stubborn, growing. Julian continued now, quieter. "If the city can optimize traffic and energy, why not protect the people who keep it clean? Why should workers have to choose between their health and their paycheck?" Elena's lips pressed together. For years, she had accepted those choices as normal, necessary, like winter itself. Julian reached into a folder and pulled out a thin booklet, new, crisp pages. He placed it in front of her. A library card and a brochure for a community education program. Literature, history, classes for adults, free, accessible, local. Elena blinked, confused. "What's this?" Julian smiled gently. "You told me once you wanted to read more, remember? You said you used to love books as a girl, before life got loud." Elena stared at the booklet as if it might vanish if she looked away. "I can't," she murmured automatically. "I have shifts." Julian didn't argue. He didn't try to rewrite her in one day. He simply rested his hand on the table near hers. "You can choose. Not today.
Not tomorrow if you're not ready, but soon, because you've done enough surviving.
Elena's breath shook slightly. She looked at her hands, those same hands that had pushed carts through snow and counted coins at night, and for the first time she let herself imagine them holding something that wasn't a tool, a book. Later that afternoon, they walked to a small community garden near the Charles River. It wasn't grand, just a patchwork of raised beds, a bench, and a path lined with young flowers. The air carried the earthy smell of watered soil and sun-warmed leaves. Elena sat on the bench. Julian sat beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The world offered its own soundtrack. Wind moving through branches, distant footsteps, the soft clink of a gardener's trowel. Elena finally broke the silence. "I thought," she said slowly, "if people saw me, they would see you differently." Julian turned to her, eyes steady. "If they see you," he said, "they see the truth." Elena's throat tightened. She nodded, once, like signing a promise. They sat together, watching the sun lower toward the river, light turning honey gold at the edges of the day. Elena's shoulders loosened, as if she had been carrying a bag too long and finally set it down. Julian reached for her hand, not to lift it for a crowd this time, but to hold it in the ordinary quiet of life. Elena let him. And in that simple gesture was the real ending. Not wealth, not fame, but a mother learning she could be loved without disappearing. Sacrifice shouldn't be a life sentence. It should be a bridge that leads everyone home. If you were Julian, what would you say to your mother in that moment? Leave a comment to honor the quiet women in your life, the ones who carried you when you didn't even know you were heavy. The story of Elena and Julian reminds us of a simple truth we often forget. The greatest love in our lives usually comes from those who choose to stand outside the spotlight. Parents do not sacrifice themselves to be praised or remembered. They sacrifice so their children can live with less fear, less worry, and with enough space to become who they truly are. Elena didn't sweep the streets to trade her labor for her son's success. She did it so Julian wouldn't have to carry the burden of survival during the most important years of his intellect and his dreams. That is a kind of motherhood that is quiet yet unbreakable, never loud, never dramatic, never asking for repayment. And it was on that silent foundation that Julian learned how to express gratitude through action, not just words. This story also asks each of us a deeper question. Have we ever taken our parents' sacrifices for granted without realizing it? How many calloused hands in our lives have we never truly held, never fully thanked? If you were Julian, what would you say to your mother in that moment, when you realize the world you are standing on was built from unseen sacrifices? Share your story in the comments. Tell us about the father, the mother, or the quiet woman who carried your heaviest days for you. Your story might become a light for someone who is still sacrificing in silence, waiting to be seen.